of participants who agree, and we have a total of 82% of participants who disagree. So I'll give now the floor to our Forus chair, Yara. Over to you, Yara.
Gracias, Arturo. Gracias a toda la equipo de Forus que está proporcionando de una manera brillante la realización de la semana Forus Virtual. Es un placer enorme tener ustedes, compañeros y compañeras, en este debate de hoy, que es sobre el financiamiento, el desarrollo en un mundo post-pandemia. Me gustaría solo observar a ustedes que cuando no estén hablando, cierren sus pantallas para mantener la calidad de la conexión. Y cuando hablan, sí abren y podemos visualizar a la persona, solo para garantizar que todos estaremos bien, escuchando bien todas las ponencias. Me gustaría, antes de empezar este debate, un poco contextualizar el tema de la financiación al desarrollo y también, obviamente, dar un poco de cómo será la lógica del debate de hoy, ¿no? Primero, obviamente, tenemos dos invitados que es un placer tenerlos. Les digo que son personas increíbles, como María José Romero y Stefano Prato, que van a hacer las primeras ponencias. Después tendremos la reflexión más corta de tres compañeros de las plataformas y luego después tendremos la participación de más 4 o 5 compañeros con preguntas a los expositores, ¿no? Claro que si después obviamente tenemos tiempo, podemos abrir más para otras preguntas y ampliar nuestro debate. Así, empiezo ahora un poco con las reflexiones que tengo y solo para contextualizar dónde estamos en este debate, ¿no? El debate de financiación al desarrollo es un debate bastante largo en términos temporales y viene desde los años 90 del siglo pasado con lo que podemos llamar del ciclo social de las Naciones Unidas, ¿no? Y que tuvo un momento muy importante en la ciudad de Monterrey, en México, cuando 50 jefes de Estado firmaron, más o menos 50, firmaron el Consenso de Monterrey, que era una agenda de combate a la pobreza y para responder a una agenda vinculada a los objetivos de desarrollo del milenio, ¿no? Que obviamente era un objetivo, ya era una reducción de todo un debate, de todo un desarrollo de propuestas, de pensar el mundo sobre otras bases a partir de las conferencias de Río en 92 hasta después la de la diversidad y bueno, de todo lo que fue desarrollado en Beijing, la conferencia de Copenhague, del hábitat, o sea, fueron discusiones que se reducieron bastante cuando hubo la construcción de la agenda del milenio con la justificativa de tener indicadores objetivos para conquistar en X tiempo, ¿no? El Consenso de Monterrey se construyó entre más o menos 6 líneas de actuación. La movilización de recursos domésticos, la movilización de recursos internacionales, desarrollo del comercio internacional, cooperación técnica, alivio de la deuda externa y la coherencia del sistema financiero internacional. Claro que son temas importantes, pero la sociedad civil, los movimientos y la academia criticó bastante este documento por su bajísima ambición en términos de las emergencias, de las necesidades del mundo a este momento, ¿no? Claro que después de eso, en lo actual ciclo, el siglo XXI, las conferencias de los procesos fueron rápidamente, presentaron rápidamente una cuestión mucho más importante y mucho más emergencial, como el tema del clima, la propia Agenda 2030, que en mi opinión es como si fuera una ODM Plus, porque amplía la agenda, intenta no más segmentar los indicadores, pero viene con la idea de no one behind, nadie puede ficar para detrás de las decisiones de enfrentamiento de la pobreza, de enfrentamiento de la desigualdad, de las discriminaciones, de la cuestión climática, etcétera, que están en los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenibles, ¿no? Entonces, el tema de financiación también, claro, por supuesto, viene fuertemente añadido a este debate, a esta agenda, ¿no? Pero también lejos de una solución y de una efectiva disposición de los países ricos de ampliar, y mismo en los países en desarrollo o pobres, con las grandes dificultades o políticas o efectivas económicas de recaudación de fondos que puedan enfrentar las emergencias que tenemos en la agenda del mundo en nuestros días. El Forus entra en esta agenda, por supuesto, porque es base de nuestras defensas por derechos humanos, por democracia, por financiación, por justicia social. Entonces, no hay cómo salir de esta agenda y no solo trabajar en la agenda 2030 sin estar vinculado al debate del núcleo duro de la economía, de cómo la plata, la financiación que el mundo tiene que recaudar para enfrentar estos desafíos. Entonces, Forus decidió entrar en este debate, creó un grupo de trabajo que viene intentando involucrar sus miembros, generar conocimiento y acción política. Está trabajando en un documento de posición del Forus que va a ser distribuido a ustedes y que yo estimulo que lo lean, lo critiquen, adicionen información y tengan una acción para que sea un documento de pertenecimiento de nosotros dentro del Forus, ¿no? Y también estamos actuando para concretamente intervenir en la conferencia que va a ocurrir en noviembre, organizado por el gobierno francés, del Financing Common, que es la reunión de más de 450 bancos públicos que van a discutir las estrategias y los retos del mundo post-pandemia. Por lo tanto, es obvio nuestro interés y nuestra necesidad de estar, de nos involucrarnos activamente en esta agenda, ¿no? Este documento es un documento que está siendo elaborado a muchas manos, pero es fundamental que ustedes lo lean y nos den un feedback. Es un documento que habla obviamente del tema de los derechos humanos, de la democracia, de la financiación de las ONGs, de los movimientos, que habla de una nueva arquitectura internacional, que habla de un nuevo sistema tributario para un mundo más justo y más sostenible. O sea, intenta tratar de todos los temas que nosotros estamos enganchados y comprometidos en nuestra agenda. Y dicho esto, yo con esta introducción me gustaría empezar nuestro diálogo con los compañeros y compañeras de este de esta sesión. Y me gustaría llamar una compañera que hace tiempo estamos juntas en muchos de estos espacios internacionales, haciendo las defensas de los derechos humanos, de la democracia y todo eso, que es la compañera María José Romero, que es directora de promoción de políticas de la Red Europea de Deuda y Desarrollo en Finanzas, Eurodad, desde 2012, y es doctoranda de Economía del Desarrollo en la Universidad de Londres. María José, un placer tenerte aquí otra vez y tienes la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Yara, muchas gracias. Igualmente, es un placer para mí. Muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días para todos. Voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés porque la tengo armada así, pero es un placer dialogar con Yara y con todos los compañeros también en español, que es mi lengua. Okay, so I will present some thoughts in the next 10 minutes on the role of public development banks in development finance. Next, you will find the content. I will be very brief in relation to the background because you all know what the COVID pandemic means for our lives, but there are some figures that I would like to share with you. Then it will be about the development finance architecture and some of the key challenges facing most public development banks. This will be present in the upcoming summit that Yara mentioned. And then I will talk about the need to reclaim public development banks for the public interest, with some core features of a model public development bank that we should all put on our radar. And I will conclude. Next. When it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, as I said, we all know how these have changed our lives and how this has resulted in a deep recession across the world, all around the world, with devastating social and economic impacts, deepening inequalities. And here I want to emphasize the latest World Bank poverty projections that suggest that by 2021, so next year, an additional between 110 and 150 million people will have fallen into extreme poverty, living on less than $1.90 per day. And this is something that is huge, and this is something that requires a response. And as UNCTAD have said, the pandemic represents such a huge risk that that there is a real problem of losing another decade and ending any hope of delivering the SDGs. As a result, there has been strong calls to build back better, with a very complicated discussion there, because this phrase that everyone or a lot of people are using these days can mean different things for different people. So we really need to think what this actually means for all of us. Next, in terms of development finance architecture and the challenges facing development banks, it's important to say that in this architecture, what we have is a wide range of public institutions and private ones. But when it comes to the public institutions, we have state-owned financial institutions that aim to deliver on public policy objectives. These are institutions that operate at different levels, national, regional, and global. And these are institutions that have development in their mandate. profit is not the overall goal of their activities, or should not be, right? Because there is here, and I will tell you more in a minute, a mismatch there in relation to what these institutions should be doing and what these or some of these institutions are actually doing. Much of the emphasis has been placed on the role of existing multilateral development banks. And here I am talking about the role of the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, etc. But national development banks are relevant players as well in providing finance to sectors and regions that private financial institutions do not serve sufficiently. So they do exist, although the neoliberal paradigm has tried to undermine them, reduce them in their size, etc. Next. So public development banks have a huge potential because they have different functions to play. And here in my slide, I highlight 5 different functions. We can go into details of all these, but I think that the main conclusion is that they can play a counter-cyclical role, which is very important. They can work and they are called to work when it comes to improving standards, insisting on, for example, human rights safeguards in the project or institutions they finance. They can also play a role in encouraging innovation, etc. And they can also work, and they do have a very important role to play when it comes to building a financial sector that works in the public interest. However, and this is, as I said, the point that I want to emphasize in relation to the mismatch between the role that they are called to play or that they should play and what is happening in reality. Most public development banks, particularly the ones working at the regional and global level, are not performing as they should, and have been rightly questioned about the negative impact of the development model promoted and their operations. And here we can think about the role that some of these institutions have played in using public money to leverage private finance, which means to subsidize private finance, which in fact does not actually help development outcomes on the ground, and impose a whole dynamic that do not work in the public interest, but serves to promote a model that keeps privatizing services and giving quite a lot of space for public interest to be served. And this has also to do with the lack of transparency and the poor accountability of the practices of some of these banks, and also the conditions that they have imposed in the loans that they have provided when it comes to supporting national governments. So their role has been skewed towards private interest over and above the public interest. And the pandemic is not helping in that regard, because it is some of the analysis that we have produced recently showed that some of these problems have intensified in the context of the pandemic. Next. So given this context and what I have said, I think that is quite relevant to say in this forum that it's important to reclaim the role of public banks and of public banking in general for the public interest, that the right type of finance needs to flow through the right type of institutions, and that private commercial, the private commercial sector is unlikely on its own to provide the type of finance needed to support developing countries to get out of the crisis, and that we had been calling, together with many civil society colleagues and organizations, to have a debate on the current development finance architecture and on the current development model promoted by some of these players. A model that is focused on mobilizing private finance is a very problematic model. And we also have to address what type of institutions are the ones that will serve a development model that is focused on people and serving people's needs first and foremost. Next. I will finish here with some of the core features of public development banks that have to be center stage in our debate, because it's not, as I said, whatever type of institution, the one that will serve an alternative development model. So we have to be looking at the institutions that have a strong development mandate and strong policies serving a development mandate aligned to the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. We need institutions with high social and environmental standards. We really need institutions that have an adequate business model, and by these we mean institutions that select from where they get their funds and how they invest their funds, with good systems in place to assess, monitor their development operations. We also need institutions that have high standards in terms of transparency, accountability, and participation. And we also need institutions that have an adequate level of resource to serve their development objectives. Next, I will conclude just saying that development banks, public development banks, are in a unique position and a very powerful position to play a role in the post-COVID-19 context, but they should be framed and they should play a different role than the one that they are playing these days, at least when it comes to the major institutions, the global and the regional ones. And civil society organizations have an opportunity to actively contribute to this debate, calling for something different to the thing that we have today. And the Financing Common Summit is just one opportunity that we should be considering in the coming weeks, but for sure there will be more opportunities and spaces at the UN serve this purpose, and I am sure that Stefano will contribute to that discussion. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, María Romero. Perfecto, perfecto, no solo en el tiempo como la síntesis. Fue brillante, ¿no? Es muy clara la reflexión que María José nos trae sobre el rol de los bancos públicos, y en especial el rol de los bancos nacionales, públicos nacionales en este proceso, ¿no? Y en la estrategia de enfrentamiento del mundo post-pandemia, porque exactamente lo que están haciendo y cómo están se moviendo no va a ser eficiente, no va a promover, ¿no? La justicia, solucionar el desequilibrio, la desigualdad que está impuesta no solo históricamente, pero agravada por el mundo post-pandemia. Por eso precisamos, ¿no? Me parece muy interesante porque María José nos llama a una acción y a una participación activa con contenido, ¿no? Que pueda forzar estas instituciones y nuestros gobiernos y también a las Naciones Unidas a actuar en este sentido. Muchas gracias. Yo ahora me gustaría de invitar un otro compañero que está también a mucho tiempo en estas plagas, en estos espacios de lucha, que es Stefano Prato, director de la Sociedad para el Desarrollo Internacional y coordinador global del Grupo de Financing for Development, de Financiamiento al Desarrollo de la Sociedad Civil, así como es copresidente del Mecanismo de Coordinación del MGOs, que por favor, Stefano, yo específicamente no logré saber lo que es el MGOs. Puedes clarear a nosotros, te agradezco. Por lo tanto, Stefano, un gusto tenerte acá. Por favor, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Ciara. Un gran placer para mí también. So I will also speak in English, if you don't mind. And let me try to spend a few minutes to explore what I could call as the foundational elements for a new economic governance architecture. Why that? First of all, and because very often we go straight into a discussion on what the new economic architecture could look like. You know, we start talking about tax reforms, debt reforms, finance regulations, but it's important to have clarity on why we need these reforms and where they need to come from and what kind of development process they are meant to support. So with your permission, I will take a few steps back from that. And the first step is actually to have a bit of clarity in terms of systemic analysis and purpose. And it's important to be analytical, but at the same time, yes, focusing on the problem, but also focusing on what we want as a response. I will not take a lot of elements from the COVID crisis. Why? Because we're talking about COVID crisis all over. And in many respects, everything I'm going to say, it's only magnified and exposed by COVID, but it is not induced by COVID. So we don't have to over-characterize this need for reform because of the pandemic. The pandemic only creates a sense of urgency and exposes what we have been trying to put under the carpet for decades. So it is very useful in that respect, but it's not necessarily an analytical entry point. So first of all, I think it's important to take a bird's eye view on the global economy. There are many ways in which we could do this according to the sustainability lens, human rights, and many others. There is one particular one that I would like to offer you, which is looking a little bit at the paradox that inequalities generates. And the reason why I do this is because multidimensional inequality, at least in my analytical framework, are critical to be able to analyze and assess the current global economy and the kind of reforms which are necessary. So if we look at the global economy with a bird's eye view through inequalities, we basically expose a paradox that traditional orthodox economic analysis cannot explain. Why? Because we have at the same time a global gap in demand. There's not sufficient high level of consumption. And this also corresponds to a decreasing share of wages in GDP. So family demand is limited, but this is also combined with an excess of liquidity. Now, this normally wouldn't happen, right? If you do not spend, that means that you have higher liquidity. but the two things in many respects are not coherent one with the other. And at the same time, there is a limited access to credit for productive activities. How is that these elements could coexist in a normal economic model? Well, they do coexist because of the incredibly high concentration of income and wealth. So we need to start from the assumption that the global economic system and the orthodox theory and institutions that look at it are no longer able to even analyze the current conjuncture because their analytical instruments are not able to capture the centrality that concentration of wealth and income have in the way in which the economic unfolds. The second important analytical dimension is the recognition that we have an international economic order that supports a very particular division of labor between countries. In fact, with hyperglobalization, we have seen an over-reliance on global value chains and an international division of labor that continues to extract resources and wealth from developing countries. This means that commodity dependence in many ways has become the normal conditions of most developing countries. 85% of the world's least developed economies are commodity dependent. Of course, dependence could be at various degrees, but that means that in many ways they do, their economic system is based on the production of primary commodities and minerals for exports, while they tend to import everything else. And interestingly, this export concentration of private commodity is very closely connected with levels of underdevelopment. Of course, this is measured by GDP. We know that is an insufficient measure, but you can see the connection why levels of commodity dependence stimulated by this particular organization of the global economy contributes to limited progress in terms of different development indicators. And this is a system that will see the prevalence of the primary sector. In most cases, complete broken relationship between primary sector and transformation. In fact, in many countries, we've seen deindustrialization or premature deindustrialization, a very heavy prevalence of sectors related to logistics, which is largely export logistics within the tertiary sector. Now, this has very heavy socio-economic consequences. And you can imagine it immediately. When the products that are being produced are actually traded for the global market and they're not marketed locally, you do not have a virtuous cycle between wages and growth. On the contrary, you have a situation in which international competitiveness tends to drive wages down. And that's the reason why we've seen the parallel development of a strong emphasis on value chains and at the same time, a decrease in the wage percentage of GDPs. So this is altogether a reason why inequality is actually perpetrated by commodity traps. In fact, commodity traps are inequality traps. And they're not only inequality traps within countries, but you can really say that inequalities within countries are trapped by inequalities between countries. And this is, I think, it's a critical notion when we look at the evolution of the economic frameworks. Furthermore, we can also say that commodity traps are very often linked to debt traps. Imagine an economy that doesn't grow, that is somehow stagnant in the export of primary commodities. That means that tax revenues are limited, and this pushes countries to borrow. And when they borrow without a vibrant economy, they tend not to have proceedings to be able to reimburse those debts. And therefore, very quickly, the reimbursement of debts goes to the detriment of critical public services such as health and education. So you see how the structure of the economy, the commodity traps links to inequality traps, debt traps, and therefore traps that open the way for the undermining, if not privatization, of public services on the premise that the government doesn't have adequate resources to move forward. Now, this means that when we look at this situation, it's important to recognize that we are confronted with a three-layered policy challenge. At the micro level, we need to recognize that we have an urgent need for a transformation of the production model. I can't speak about this today here, but it is essential, you know, because we're talking about a business model that generates increasing externalities in health, ecological, and social-cultural dimensions. And this is closely connected with the shift towards the global that many economies have. At the meso level, we have a very significant challenge given by the need to shift the center of gravity away from the global, away from the export, in favor of more vibrant domestic economies. And at the macro level, we need to remove the systemic obstacles for such transformation. Now, these are closely interconnected. However, however, as much as these are closely interconnected, there is a particular role for the meso level, and this is particularly important for this meeting, because also in the way in which Forus is structured and the national platforms, there is a particular role of the national level into this process of transformation. Let's see what this would be like. Well, my second step beyond this analytical approach and the identification of this past policy challenge is really the need for a new global economic consensus. And that global consensus, as this image shows, really needs to move away from measuring the economy by how well the rich people are doing. I think we need a completely different approach. Now, where does this lie? My hypothesis here is that the meso policy transformation, actually the fact of focusing much more energy into rethinking economic policies away from the global and towards vibrant and inclusive social economy is actually the critical step in the process, even before we get to the international architecture. This is the fundamental step. What does it mean? It means that we need a new theory for structural transformation, not the orthodox theory we had in the past, but one that places equity and equality at the core of an agenda for economic diversification. And this requires a new socio-ecological contract, something which is done within our countries, in which we can create a virtuous cycle between the growth of wages, the increase of employment, the raise of domestic demand, and economic expansion. And all of these consistently with the ecological footprint.
Stefano, disculpa intervenir solo. Sorry, just because the interpreters, they are asking you to speak slowly.
Sorry.
Thank you, sorry about that.
Apologies to the interpreters. So just to take a step back. So important to recognize that we have this micro, meso, and macro challenge. But the meso level, what we can do within the national space is of critical importance, because it is what unlocks both the micro and the macro. And the essence of this change is to shift the center of gravity of economic planning and economic policy making away from the integration into the global economy and into the strengthening of the domestic economies. This requires a new socio-ecological contract between people and between different social groups that is able to create a virtuous cycle between the growth of wages, the expansion of the domestic demand, economic expansions, and all consistent with an ecological sound footprint. Now, such a transformation agenda doesn't exclude the global. We're not talking about close our boundaries to the global, but rather it's a shifting of the barycenter away from the exports and into the domestic activity. Now, this leads to an agenda for re-architecture of our economic consensus. And the guiding star of this process is that of rebalancing the barycenters towards the United Nations and move away from the current exclusivity of the Bretton Woods institution and even the G20. First of all, this is an effort of democratization of economic governance because it allows all countries to speak with one voice and win one vote into a common process, but also, as imperfect as it might be, because it allows also us, civil society and other societal constituencies to engage in the process to be able to bridge all the democratic deficits that the intergovernmental process has. But this also helps reconnecting the economy with human rights and reconnecting economic planning with all other systemic dimensions of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So we need to shift the center of gravity in favor of much greater and strengthened role of the United Nations in economic governance. And this is the call that the Civil Society FFD group has been making over the past months for an international economic reconstruction and system reform summit under the aegis of the UN, where to rebuild this kind of economic consensus. Now, what are the elements of this consensus? There are three pillars which are relatively clear, if one can say so. Don't look at the text. I'm putting it here so that I can share the presentation and you can look at it before, but just in terms of macro perspective. Number one, we need to free developing countries from the slavery of debt. And this requires both an extensive debt cancellation agenda and a new sovereign debt workout mechanism to be hosted under the aegis of the United Nations. This is the only context in which we can go beyond the limitations of a donor-driven approach, a sort of a donor-driven tribunal to single countries, as we do now in the Paris Club, that doesn't appreciate that systemic determinants of the debt crisis, which among many others are also in what I've presented before. The second important pillar of this new architecture is to really tackle illicit financial flows and to rewrite comprehensively the global tax rules, tackle tax havens, tax abuse by multilateral cooperation and other illicit financial flows. And this cannot be in the hands of the OECD. It needs to be negotiated equally and comprehensively in a universal manner under the aegis of the United Nations. The third, and maybe less intuitive, because I'm sure you're familiar with this too. The third, and still extremely important, is to shift and change gear on our discussion on technology assessment under the United Nations. It's very clear that technology, together with finance, are one of the drivers of hyperglobalization, and you've even seen that during the COVID phase. So it's essential to create mechanisms for technology justice and for technology governance in the UN context. And to conclude, this is my last slide, there are two areas which are a little bit less intuitive and a little bit more complicated. The first one is that we need to relaunch a trade and development conversation in the United Nations. There is a complete mess in the multilateral trading system, as you know very well. And the UN which has literally almost stepped out of the trade and development conversation because of the pretense that the WTO could address this issue, need to step forcefully back in. And lastly, we need to initiate, and this I underscore initiate, a very strong discussion on the regulation of global finance. And this, again, has many dimensions. You can look at them in the slides before, but this can only be initiated not by those countries that actually thrive on global finance, but in the context of a development and finance conversations, precisely as the trade and development conversations. Of course, these are many issues, and overall, we also need to have a lot of imagination, because this is the moment in which we need to somehow rethink and reinvent the system or an architecture of institutions that can manage today's global economy, which is not the global economy that came out of the Second World War. So these are just few ideas, but it's important to stress, to conclude, the importance of the meso level. If we do not center our focus on a new agenda for socio-economic transformation at national level, there is virtually no possibility to engage in a fruitful discussion on the changes of the global international architecture. Thank you so much, and sorry for being a bit long.
Muchas gracias, Stefano. Realmente fue una ponencia súper densa y súper importante, que, bueno, parte de las preguntas, ¿por qué necesitamos las reformas? ¿De dónde tienen que venir? ¿No? Tener claridad, saber lo que queremos, la necesidad de una no viene por la pandemia, más la pandemia como amplifica, ¿no? Es una cuestión más histórica. Y habla de los paradojos de la desigualdad, que tenemos que mudar el mundo de los negocios, del modelo de producción, cambio del centro de la gravedad para favorecer la economía doméstica, la transformación de la transformación de los obstáculos estructurales para la transformación, desarrollar un nuevo consenso económico mundial, reestructuración de una nueva agenda y una nueva arquitectura mundial. O sea, estoy haciendo, básicamente intentando subrayar algunos de los puntos que obviamente Stefano nos presentó con mucha más y densidad, y espero que podamos ahora establecer un diálogo. Me gustaría, antes de pasar a la palabra a Arturo, que va a presentar algunos avisos necesarios. Por favor, Arturo, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Yara. And announcements for those who just joined the call. This session has simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. So if you wish to listen to this conference in English, please select the English audio channel. This can be done by clicking on the globe shift button that you have at the bottom right on your screen. If the option does not appear, please click on the 3 dots at the bottom right of your screen, and there you can select the English channel. Une annonce pour ceux qui viennent de rejoindre la session. Une interprétation simultanée est assurée en anglais, français et espagnol. Donc, si vous souhaitez écouter cette session en français, veuillez sélectionner la chaîne audio en français. Pour ce faire, il suffit de cliquer sur le bouton en forme de planète portant la mention interprétation en bas et à droite de votre écran. Si l'option n'apparaît pas, cliquez sur les 3 points en bas et à droite de votre écran et vous pouvez y seleccionner le canal audio en français. Un pequeño recordatorio para todos aquellos que acaban de unirse a esta sesión. Esta sesión cuenta con interpretación simultánea profesional en inglés, francés y español. Si desea escuchar esta conferencia en español, por favor seleccione el canal de audio en español. Esto lo puede hacer pulsando en el botón con forma de globo que dice interpretación en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Si la opción no aparece, haga clic en los 3 puntos de la parte inferior de la pantalla a la derecha. Allí podrá seleccionar el canal en español. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Yara.
Muchas gracias, Arturo. Ahora, entonces seguimos. Me gustaría ahora pasar a un momento donde tendremos 3 compañeros y compañeras que van a hacer una interacción con las 2 ponencias de María José y de Stefano, y ellos tendrán 5 minutos para presentar sus reflexiones. Yo llamo entonces el compañero de la plataforma de Finlandia, Fingo, Rili. Por favor, Rili, tienes la palabra.
Thank you, Yara, and special thanks for Maria Jose and Stefano. And I think it was extremely inspiring, inspiring words what you mentioned. And I think that we definitely need this kind of taking the time and really thinking at the moment, because we definitely have perhaps the only moment during our lives when we can really reflect about the current financial situation. And I think that we definitely need to take the floor and really finding a little bit some kind of out of the box thinking, which I think Stefano very well presented about the thoughts. So that way, I think that it's extremely important time for all the Forus members to really think what could be our contribution for this debate. And I think that we all agree about this talk about that definitely the United Nations has to be the place where we have to have the much better control. It's a question of the democracy thing as well. It's the only most equal place for all the member states, hopefully also for us as a civil society in the future, much more on that. And we need to really get the finance really on the core arena of the UN discussions out from the Bretton Woods Institute, and really finding the ways how we can really put the whole finances as a tool, not as a core business of the UN or the member states or whoever, but really using that as a tool for really promoting and finding the solutions towards on a better future, especially for those who are most in the vulnerable positions. So I think that we definitely need to use about the role of the UN and really, like Stefano said, really linking that back to the sustainable development, including the climate change and on the other human rights, etc. Places. I think we as a Forus, we should think about carefully about the role of the trade, because anyway, we can't really get rid of that. It's so fundamentally part of this whole system of the work at the moment, but really challenging which kind of trade we are ready to promote. So that's one angle. I'm coming a little bit back on that afterwards. Another one is the taxation. And coming from Finland, I'm extremely happy taxpayer. We really have the system which has been really one of the beauties, how exactly the whole society quite quickly, less than 100 years, has really managed to grown up from the very, very developed and poor country, from the very rich country. And one of the key issues has been the taxation. And it's the question of the transparency, it's a question of the democracy. And I think that could be one thing what we can really carefully look as well on that. I think the one element is extremely important is also that how do we see about the measuring of the progress. And one idea where we have worked quite a long time with several of other colleagues as well is about this talk of beyond growth. How we are exactly coming back on that, what is the role of the finances? And we need to really think about the growth as such, like it's understood in the previous lives. It doesn't really work anymore. And we need to really have the focus on the inequalities and really the well-being, both of the people and the planet. And then we are coming back to that, still the functioning system, that most of the actors are really just interested about the results, how we are measuring the progress. And then we are coming back to that, what are the tools, how we are measuring, and mainly to GDP. And I would like to ask from the both speakers about how do you see about this measuring thing? Should we really talk about the other indicators than GDP? and what they could be, and how could we take this aspect as a part of this whole discussions what we are having now on the plate. And my last point is linked to the role of the national platforms, where I really think that we have a absolutely crucial role in really debating and promoting the discussions and debate back home in the national level. We need to push, we need to really force our policymakers, civil servants to talk about the new kind of finances or the architecture, what it really could be. And that's why I think that these kind of events are absolutely important in the capacity building point of view, but we definitely need to raise awareness towards the citizens so that they are really, as a part of us, debating and challenging about our system on that. And hopefully in this co-creation, we can also create the opportunities and the solutions, how exactly it should be fit and build, depending again about the national realities. But I think that this is a huge potential to really get the citizens on board, and where the national platforms really plays very, very important role on that. Okay, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, compañero Really Lapalainen de Finlandia por sus reflexiones y preguntas. Yo paso ahora a la compañera Pina, Josefina Huamán, de la mesa de la ANC en Perú.
De la mesa de articulación de plataformas de 17 países de la región. Muchas gracias por estar aquí presentes. Creo un motivo de aprendizaje y de discusión y de debate. Yo quería hacer algunas reflexiones partiendo de que este es un debate no económico, sino es un debate político también. ¿Y por qué lo digo? Desde la intervención de Yara, creo que valdría recordar lo que significó Busan 2011, en el sentido siguiente, en que Busan reconoce que los actores fundamentales del desarrollo, y en el numeral 22 reconoce a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil su derecho a participar como protagonistas del desarrollo. Pero al mismo tiempo, si uno analiza la declaración de Busan, se da cuenta de que hay una mención privilegiada en muchos acápites al sector privado. En estos años hemos vivido con esa dualidad de reconocer la sociedad civil y sus organizaciones, pero sobre todo la confianza que es el sector privado el que va a permitir el desarrollo, y por lo tanto hay que darle una cantidad de concesiones para que puedas jugar ese rol protagónico. Yo lo dejo en ese punteo porque creo que es importante saber que estas reformas que se quieren hacer hay que preguntarse quién las va a hacer y quiénes van a entrar en pugna en lo que nosotros quisiéramos que fuera. La segunda comentario tiene que ver con lo que ha dicho Stefano muy claramente, que la crisis no viene por la pandemia, también lo ha dicho María José, sino que la crisis viene agravada por la pandemia, pero la crisis es antes. Yo puedo ver documentos de la CAF es del Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina, que tiene a 19 países, 17 países de la región, más España y Portugal, que ya en su evaluación que acaban de tener del 2020, señala con mucha fuerza de que hay un desaceleramiento general de la economía mundial que viene casi desde el 2011. Y entonces hay que señalar esto como un elemento marco importantísimo. Se desacelera la economía mundial y al mismo tiempo se va configurando una nueva geografía económica justamente por la pugna por la hegemonía básicamente China y Estados Unidos, que para nuestra región tiene mucha importancia porque ambos países son países con los que hay una comercialización muy importante. Y esto nos lleva a decir que si se desacelera la economía, esas economías primario exportadoras a las que ha mencionado Estefano también pierden dinamismo, porque las demandas que nosotros hemos tenido en la región de las materias primas, sobre todo la de los minerales, ha bajado su demanda y por lo tanto también ha bajado sus precios, y esa misma economía primario exportadora está siendo golpeada por esta crisis que se ha agravado, como se ha señalado. Los flujos de capital han disminuido, las inversiones han disminuido y por lo tanto nuestro ritmo de crecimiento ya en la región, en casi todos los países, iba bajando paulatinamente. Entonces, crisis antes, crisis que se agrava. Y este agravamiento de la crisis por la pandemia no es poca cosa. Y es porque nosotros, según datos de la CEPAL, hemos retrocedido en la economía 10 años y 15 años hemos retrocedido en los indicadores sociales. Se dice que en la región se va a decrecer en 9%, y la comercialización va a bajar en menos 23%. Por lo tanto, el número de desocupados va a ser histórico en la región, 14% en la región, y eso esconde los casos más dramáticos, y hay 45 millones de personas en situación de pobreza. Y lo que nosotros podemos percibir es que las medidas que se han tomado, las medidas de emergencia sanitaria o de reactivación económica, han sido hasta ahora insuficientes. Entonces creo que en este contexto hay que mirar lo que Estefano llamaba qué tipo de modelo de desarrollo tenemos la oportunidad de plantear. Creo que hay 3 elementos muy importantes. El primer elemento es revisar nuestros marcos conceptuales, incluso la noción de pobreza, los promedios nacionales, qué significa, cómo se plantea lo que es el Producto Bruto Interno. Me parece que no sé si hay una crisis conceptual para entender lo que está pasando, o tenemos que repensarla y remirarla. En segundo lugar, creo que esta es una oportunidad para plantear algo que se ha dejado en la región, justamente por haber reprimarizado la economía de casi todos los países de la región, y es el señalar que tenemos una oportunidad de generar un modelo de desarrollo que de alguna manera ya está inspirado en la Agenda 2030. No digo que nos diga la Agenda 2030 qué hay que hacer, pero es el crecimiento hacia adentro, el crecimiento del mercado interno, el crecimiento de una diversificación de la producción en países mega diversos biológicamente, como es el caso de América Latina, donde hay recursos naturales, donde hay un recurso escaso y que va a ser en los próximos años motivo seguramente de mucha atención internacional, que es el agua. Tenemos el Amazonas. Entonces, creo que es poner el énfasis en la diversificación productiva y no en los monocultivos o solamente economías de exportación, con el poco cuidado que estos han tenido en las personas y en el ambiente. Entonces, no es reeditar quizás en los procesos de industrialización que tuvimos entre el 50 y el 80 en la región, pero sí pensar que hay un proceso de utilización de una tecnología que sea intensiva del uso de mano de obra y por lo tanto empleo sea uno de los objetivos centrales, porque sin empleo no hay ingresos, sin ingresos no hay demanda, si no hay demanda no hay movimiento de la economía, pero sobre todas las cosas, si no hay ingresos, no hay la posibilidad de una sobrevivencia clara. El tema es de dónde vienen los fondos y evitar que en este momento vuelva la región a un proceso de endeudamiento crítico, aunque hay países, como el caso de Argentina, que está muy endeudado, pero creo que no estamos en una situación de endeudamiento grave, pero podría correrse el riesgo de mantener las viejas formas de producción pre-crisis, digamos, o pre-oportunidad que nos da también la pandemia, y que no mantengamos formas de producción que sean dependientes de préstamos del Fondo Monetario o el banco, con los condicionamientos que nos puedan traer algunos, con las indicaciones, con las firmas que teníamos que hacer años anteriores de firmar los acuerdos de préstamos con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, con todo el paquete de qué tipo de economía debíamos tener. Y en cuarto lugar, me parece que los fondos también vienen de la...
Pina, por favor, habla un poquito más despacito, y también estamos ya necesitando cerrar.
Sí, es la importancia de la reforma del sistema tributario, lo que se llama la justicia fiscal, en el sentido de que nosotros debemos evitar la evasión, la elusión y los paraísos fiscales en este momento. Es clarísimo que la corrupción ha marcado también en América Latina la dificultad de tener los recursos para las acciones básicas de la satisfacción de las necesidades. Yo estoy de acuerdo y ahí finalizo, quizás, disculpa que he ido muy rápido, pero hay muchas cosas que decir, que nosotros en la región tenemos el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, que acaba dejando una histórica tradición en la región de director, ha sido un director impuesto por Estados Unidos, y por el otro lado la CAF, que creo que, como ustedes han mencionado, tanto uno como otro no tiene mecanismos de transparencia y rendición de cuentas, y menos de participación real de organizaciones de la sociedad civil, especializadas o no, porque no creo que solamente los grandes especialistas tienen que hacer incidencia, sino que tiene que ser una apropiación mayor, porque de otra manera la correlación de fuerzas hacia el cambio no va a fortalecerse si es que no tiene un respaldo de organizaciones y movimientos, y hacemos entender sencillamente, como lo hace María José muy bien, esos temas que aparentemente son complejos, pero que alejan a la mayoría de la sociedad organizada de comprender para incidir, comprender para movilizar, comprender para cambiar. Disculpa la rapidez y el tiempo que me he tomado. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Pina. Fue brillante sus observaciones y reflexiones sobre nuestra región. Me gustaría solo hablar a Estefano y María José, que estoy primero poniendo los otros panelistas para hablar, y después ustedes pueden responder en conjunto. ¿Ok? Y también reforzar el tema de hablar un poco despacito. Yo también me llamaron la atención por la rapidez, es una tendencia, pero estamos viendo muy bien. Muchas gracias a todos. Yo ahora llamaría una otra compañera también con la cual tenemos una historia de articulación bastante importante con los compañeros de África. Nuestra compañera de la plataforma portuguesa, Rita Leone. Por favor, Rita, es un placer tenerte acá. Tienes la palabra.
Thank you so much, Yara. Hello, everyone here from Portugal. I would just congratulate the previous contributions by Ghili and also by Josefina. It leaves a small space to say anything else because it was so relevant what was said. But I would like to emphasize maybe and concentrate on the role of civil society, especially in terms of not only participation, but that we should really be concerned with the way mechanisms, financing mechanisms as well, are prepared for civil society to participate. There's a tendency that we all should be, and we are for sure, very aware to instrumentalize civil society's role and action as implementers of policies and not recognizing the role and the fact that we are an actor of our own will and with our own relevance, and that we have an agenda of our own that should be also taken into account, and that our role is essential in terms of public interest. Civil society organizations and movements are the participation of citizens in public policies, and thus all the support and all the enabling mechanisms that can be created are really important to be sure that civil society continues to contribute by being watchdogs, monitoring policies, evaluating, participating to get governments to fill their role is really, really important. And in that sense, I would like to emphasize something that was said as well, which is related with the private sector's involvement, which is very critical and should be, we, civil society, should be really working in terms of Forus and other networks to better prepare and better increase the dialogue that's constructive in terms of this participation, because all the narrative that we've been aware and that was said before is pointed to the fact that the private sector can and will contribute to what's lacking in terms of finance for development to accomplish the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement. So we should really discuss this issue and should be central for our advocacy and for our work in terms of civil society. Other things that are really important that should be of our concern and were already mentioned in our opinion here at our platform are issues related with debt relief and the promotion of debt justice, which is one of the main issues that is now preventing the public sector in many countries to deliver in terms of social rights for the people and social services. So we think that we should really work on this issue as well. Besides that, it was always also said that that is the issue of tax evasion, the issue of illicit financial flows, the tax havens and so on. These are all issues that obstruct the redistribution and drain resources that are crucial. There's already studies that prove that the amount of illicit flows that are taken from the countries, it's more extensive than, for example, official development assistance, which is another issue that in our platform, at least, we've been working, and it's very crucial towards the future, because official development assistance plays a crucial role, is a crucial instrument focused on improving the living conditions of the most fragile populations, is centered on eradicating poverty and reducing structural inequalities, at the same time as promoting human rights and protecting the environment. So we should really also try to have ODA continue to be structural and to be not diverted and not used to support, as has been said as well, to private sector, to profit-driven interventions. I would just leave a question, and I would congratulate first for the important contributions that were given before by Maria Jose Romero and Stefano Prato, especially by highlighting what is crucial for us to work on and for addressing something that I think is the most important and the most challenging aspect we have now as civil society, which is related with thinking a new model. We are talking about the creativity that Stefano Prato mentioned is crucial. There's really a need, and also Josefina talked about the crisis of concepts, a conceptual crisis, which is a very interesting approach, and really is a very big challenge for us as civil society to think of a new model, to construct a new narrative that can be centered on a social economy, that can be centered on inclusive and sustainable business models that come and help and are linked with the people that are most left behind globally. So I would just leave a question. I would just end my intervention and leave a question that is especially related to this. And this is a question for Stefano and for Maria Jose. How can civil society and CSOs and movements, social movements as such, contribute to a most fruitful process of rethinking the system and being so creative that we need to be? Thank you so much for Forus for organizing this very interesting session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rita. Muito obrigada, Rita. Muito obrigada por sua intervenção. Gracias, Rita, por su intervención. Muy importante las cuestiones y la pregunta que usted nos trae. Ahora paso la palabra a María José y luego después a Stefano para que puedan reaccionar a las tres intervenciones hechas ahora por Lili, Pina y Rita. Muchas gracias. María José, tienes la palabra.
Gracias, Yara, y compañeras, compañeros, por las preguntas y los comentarios. Voy a cambiar al inglés nuevamente aquí. Okay, I will address three main things, and I will include in these things the two questions that colleagues raised. First, I will talk about the response that the Bretton Woods institutions are providing to this COVID-19 crisis. Because I think that this is also crucial to understand why we need to go for an alternative model and why we need to develop this thinking that both myself and Stefano suggested, and that colleagues also confirm in their interventions. I will be very brief, but I will just summarize the World Bank and IMF response to the crisis by saying that they are offering most of the same, or quite a lot of the same thing that they have offered so far, despite the very ambitious rhetoric that they are developing these days that have to do with the Building Back Better narrative, they do whatever it takes, to overcome the crisis, etc. The institutions have developed and embraced this very ambitious narrative, but in reality, the IMF is ready to go with austerity in their intervention at the country level, while the World Bank is ready to put quite a lot of resources in creating markets, including in low-income countries, dedicating quite a lot of their resources to support the financial sector, the private commercial financial sector, so basically banks, and large multinational companies. While they are also doing some emergency response to the health crisis, they are using most of their resources to do that, while including a lot of conditions, as I said, to create markets, to deregulate, to liberalize, etc. So that's why I think, and that's why I chose this specific topic to react to your interventions. That's why I think, and we have been quite active with many civil society colleagues in challenging also the response coming from these institutions, because if we keep relying on them as the main players coming out of this crisis, or as the main players of the international financial architecture, we will keep with the same problems that, as Stefano said and as colleagues said, have pushed us into this crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic has amplified. And here I would like to include the point that comes from the question that really from Finland raised, that has to do with other ways of measuring well-being, progress, etc. I think that there has been some attempts from the UN agencies to go for something different. These in some cases have been very valuable attempts. In Latin America, there has been attempts to go for well-being, the Buen Vivir, that at some point got quite a lot of attention in Latin America. I would be cautious here in terms of the risk that we have when the Bretton Woods institutions and other main players like the G20, for instance, or others, appropriate this language or some key points of our narrative and go with that. Because this gets the concept quite empty, because the concept ends up being used for the purpose of a model that is not exactly the one that we want to support. So I would say that there has to be quite a lot of work from civil society, from progressive academics and other forces to actually come up with something that is truly alternative. And finally, the question that Rita raised when it comes to the role of civil society organizations. I think that there is, as I said, a very important role for organizations to play at the national level when it comes to challenging models and practices that come at the national level. And also when it comes to the role that some governments, and now I am thinking about the role of platforms working in Europe, in European countries, because some of these countries also play a role, a very important role at the global level. So there is this work to be strengthening, and that has to be strengthening to play a more active role there. We as citizens and civil society organizations need to go beyond our boundaries and engage in different conversations, also trying to reach out to trade unions, progressive academics, social movements, etc. And even to we really need to even engage the media to raise our voice as strong as possible to call for something different. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, María José. Excelentes sus respuestas y reacciones. Yo paso ahora para Stefano.
Thank you so much. And I guess both the three interventions raise a number of comments in addition to the questions, many of which I agree with. I think MJ has responded quite comprehensively, and of course I am in agreement with her. I would like just to raise two important issues for me. The first one is actually starting from the last question, our role as civil society. I am deeply convinced that the challenge we are confronted with now it's not one of development implementation, but is one of policy reorientation and policy design and corresponding re-architecture of our institutions. Therefore, we are now called in a moment in which our policy role is more important than ever. And this requires a much stronger convergence across our traditional divisions. For instance, there has been in many ways an almost an abandonment of the economic discourse, you know, because we focused much more on social discourses because this is where our constituencies are and because these are the issues that matters to our people most. But as a result, we've tended to drop the economic discourse and we just criticized the economic framework, and we have every right to do it. But we have somehow not played a significant role in offering an alternative economic formulation of what those frameworks are about. So for instance, in my presentation, I focused explicitly on the economic agenda, not because this is in neglect of a critical agenda for social services and for socio-economic and cultural dimensions other than the economic one, but because we need to reappropriate and reclaim an economic planning which is consistent with our ambitions in terms of human rights, in terms of the fight with climate emergency, and much more. This also means to be clear on when we are, for instance, putting forward a number of formulation on the fact that we want stronger public services, or where we expect the resources to come from. Now, of course, I know very well most of our governments, starting from mine, they spend money where they shouldn't, and therefore there's a lot of possibility of reallocation. But overall, we need to be careful that our call for stronger and public health systems or education system and everything else doesn't correspond in either a call for purely development aid or a call that actually promotes, even unintendedly, privatization. Because when we want more health services and the government is not in a position to provide them because of a number of resource limitations, this is where the pressure also mounts for finding these nonsensical private solutions that MJ talked a lot about. So this is the importance to put the emphasis on the fact that if we want stronger public services, we need a stronger, vibrant economy that provides stronger tax revenues that should be able to be allocated to those services that we demand and we very much need. So what is important is to have a financing agenda that supports our social and human rights claims that is consistent with the kind of new economic order that we would like. And we haven't been very good at that until now. So we need to certainly try to bridge much more across some of the different domains. For instance, another example, the economic transformation agenda should be centered on food systems. This is the core of every economy. So the claim for an agroecological transformation, the claim for food sovereignty, the claim for a much bigger role of our small-scale food producers in really a vibrant local food systems, rather than a food system where food is largely imported, even if we export food, is actually a critical part of the agenda. So in a nutshell, it's important to do a work of reconnecting agenda, because our imperative is to engage in a policy challenge much more than in an implementation challenge. Very last comment on the issue of indicators. I do agree that GDP is unhelpful at best, and that we need a much more sophisticated measure of well-being. However, we need to be careful not to get lost into this discussion. I very much agree with what MJ has connected. I mean, even the degrowth narrative is intellectually very stimulating, but many developing economies do require economic development. Let's call it economic development. Let's not call it economic growth. But it is without doubt, there is a need of a much stronger and vibrant and inclusive economy. So let's be careful with using proper taxonomy and not get into intellectual loops, and maintain a very strong and clear political agenda ahead of us as much as possible in conjunction with other movements. And this is where the role of national platforms is absolutely critical, because it's a perfect space where to actually exercise that synthesis. There's too much vertical engagement along thematic roads into the global, and little synchrony and synthesis that is done at that level. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Stefano. Muy buenas respuestas. Yo ahora voy a pasar para una serie de preguntas a nuestros otros compañeros de las plataformas, pero me gustaría alertarlos que el tiempo está corto, por lo tanto les pido que no ultrapasen los 2-3 minutos para su pregunta, para que tengamos tiempo para las respuestas de nuestros compañeros que hicieron la ponencia, y también hacer el cierre de nuestra sesión. Por lo tanto, ya llamo acá, paso la palabra al compañero Ricardo Roba, de la Concord, que es la coalición de plataformas europeas, que es miembro de Forus. Mucho gusto, Ricardo, tenga la palabra.
Muchas gracias, y gracias a Forus por organizar este evento. I will speak in English. So I have actually a question, not only for the panelists, but for all the participants in this event as NGOs National Platform, because what we've seen as Concord is that in the international arena, when the pandemic hit, several countries, not all to be honest, but several donor countries have prioritized multilateral options, multilateral responses, such as the World Bank and its pandemic financing for facility, the World Health Organization, Gavi. And on the contrary, generally speaking, CSOs haven't been either consulted in the drafting of those responses to COVID, nor significantly involved as implementers of those responses. So what I would be interested to hear, but partially the two speakers have replied already, is how to react to that. Which are the arguments that you've been using in your advocacy vis-a-vis your national governments, vis-a-vis international organizations, to make sure that in the recovery plans, starting from tomorrow, NGOs, CSOs will be more effectively involved together with our agendas in the dialogue with national governments. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Muchas gracias por la brevedad de la cuestión. Yo voy a hacer voy a llamar a los compañeros y compañeras en bloque, después pasamos a las respuestas. Bom, yo no sé si María Nauni Ross está. María está. Si María no está, yo voy a leer la pregunta que debería hacer a nuestros compañeros. Yo voy a hacer en inglés. How will funding be adapted to the new needs raised by civil society organizations following the impact of COVID-19? How will funding bodies adapt and become more flexible to the needs of the moment? Y ahora paso a la pregunta, por favor, llamando al compañero Julián Conlam Agbesi de REPAOC. Tiene la palabra.
Allô?
Julián.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Vous me recevez?
Oui, oui.
Oui, allô?
Allô?
Oui, vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui,
Vous me suivez?
We understand you. You can go. You can go. Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. My question will be in French. Oui, allez-y, allez-y. Je vous remercie infiniment de cette audience, de cet espace que vous nous offrez. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Ça touche au contexte que nous vivions avant la crise sanitaire et que nous continuons de vivre. C'est le contexte du terrorisme et de l'insécurité. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Si l'on peut évoquer la lutte contre le terrorisme et l'insécurité en général pour justifier le contrôle des sources de financement des OSC par les pouvoirs publics, que pensez-vous de l'effet de cette pratique de contrôle des sources de financement des OSC sur la disponibilité de l'appui que les OSC peuvent attendre des bailleurs et des donateurs? Est-ce que ma question a été bien claire? Vous m'avez entendu?
Yes, yes, yes. Very clear questions, Julián. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Arjun Batarai from the Nepalese platform.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank Stefano for comprehensive presentation and all panelists from country level sharing important issues. I am going to share here briefly about current scenario of developing financing of Nepal and short question to Stefano. Nepal has per capita national debt of $332 compare of to $312 of the year 2018. In the long run, in the public debt is too large. It is like driving with the emergency brake on. Over dependency on the external debt can be a possible cause of debt payment default and ultimately economic collapse of the nations. So therefore, my question is, what are the pros and cons of the debt and aid? Is the debt better comparatively than the debt? How? So this is my question to Stefano. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you very much for the questions. Now I turn the floor to our friends, Maria Jose, Stefano. Now I ask Stefano to begin, and then Maria Jose after him. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. First of all, I need to apologize in case you see my connection going off sort of unexpectedly. I've been operating on a phone and PC battery because I have a power break, and I think I am at a very, very low level. So in case I disconnect, that's the reason. So let me try to give some brief answers to the questions that were formulated. It's very clear. I mean, first of all, I see the point of the sort of multilateral responses, but I'm not sure I fully agree. Meaning there has been a phase in which, unfortunately, we've seen a resurgence of very strong nationalistic response. I mean, there has been then progressively an attempt to rebuild a phase of multilateral engagement. It's true anyway that in many of these situations, the engagement with multilateral facilities have been driven by emergencies and without due processes of consultation. And this is definitely a big concern. There is right now a significant disconnect between, even in the movements that work more together in terms of their collective advocacy processes, between the relation with national governments and the multilateral advocacy. This is something that needs some new rebuilding. Partly is also that, if I can say so, this connects to what I've said before. Our capacity to engage on economic justice issues has been weakened over the years. If you look, and with this I connect also to the funding question, the entire phase of the MDGs, I've seen a very strong emphasis on the role of NGOs as implementers, you know, for basically primary service delivery or anyway development progress implementation. And many of the capacity for political analysis, economic analysis, and political and economic advocacy have actually been largely defunded. Some people have actually said that there's been a systematic deconstruction of any structure of dissent with the, let's say, the dynamics of hyper-globalization. I do tend to agree that that has happened. If you consider the strength of the political articulation in the Global South that we had prior to this phase and the actual weakness that this has today, you could really see how funding has selected development servicing and development implementation versus you know, political capacity and policy capacity. And this means that then when we are in this situation of very limited policy capacity, generally scattered nationally and globally, our capacity to connect national advocacy agenda and global advocacy agenda is very weak. And many national platforms, if I can say, have had very limited engagement on issues such as debt, illicit financial flows, and general economic governance, trade issues. How many people actually engage in trade and how important the trade regimes are in our current situation. So there is a disconnect there that we need to follow. On the question on Nepal, it's very difficult to say in general if there are pros and cons of debt versus aid. I personally think that there's nothing, debt is not bad. It's a very good instrument that countries can use to ensure that they can meet their development needs, particularly in a phase in which their economy is still not able to generate adequate proceedings. However, there are a number of issues with debt. It needs to be legitimate. It needs to be, we need to make sure that it's democratically accountable, because we need to make sure that debt that is raised is actually go to meeting those, public objectives rather than servicing objectives that we don't share, and needs to be sustainable. And its sustainability requires an economic planning that allows the economy to grow in a consistent manner with the debt repayment agenda, because otherwise, immediately, the consequence is austerity, defunding of public services, and of course, privatization and other forms of private first approaches that MJ has described. On aid, I personally think aid is, it's probably still necessary today. We can do without, and at the same time, we shouldn't let developed countries off the hook on the 0.7% promise, which, by the way, it's an important anniversary precisely these days. But on the other hand, aid is just another dimension of dependency, exactly as commodity dependence, as debt dependency, and so forth. So we need to also be able to envision a future in which we emancipate ourselves from ODA, and to realize that sometimes it's much more ODA donors that require ODA than sometimes the recipient. Now, of course, in that, and to conclude, whenever we challenge the role of ODA, we also challenge many of the financing mechanisms of current civil society operations. So we also need to start thinking, what are new modalities of financing which are not exclusively related on donor financing? And here, there's a lot of imagination that is required. But the earlier we start that journey, the better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Maria Jose, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the comments and questions. I will address them all together because I think that they are very connected. I would agree with Stefano when he said that at the beginning of the pandemic, the response was quite inward looking, was quite nationally oriented, and countries were looking for ways of dealing with the crisis that was in that way. Later on, from European countries in particular, there was a focus on regional and multilateral responses as well. And there, I could say that some of the messages and key points that us Eurodad and with our members and many other organizations we have been trying to emphasize is the importance of the use of the resources in such a way that they end up solving or serving the purpose of responding to this very crucial and devastating crisis, and not amplifying or even creating additional problems to the ones that countries already faced. So in that regard, we have been paying special attention to the instruments by which this multilateral and regional response has been channeled through. So if it comes to, as I said before, the use of the financial sector in the case of the World Bank, or the use of specific guarantees or instruments to subsidize the private sector, we had been trying to shed light on this and expose the problematic aspects of instruments like this, that instead of supporting countries to navigate the crisis, they are even creating additional problems for people and for communities because of all the implications of them. Also in terms of the sectors that received the resources. And here we have been trying to emphasize the need to go for social sectors, the need to preserve jobs, decent jobs, the need to use resources in such a way that actually serve the sectors and the people that need resources the most. And the same thing when it comes to accountability and transparency of these resources. And finally, also the fact of protecting resources for civil society organizations that play a key role at the national level, as we have said before, because these are organizations that need to work also in dealing with the crisis and the conditions under which all of us have being forced to work in the context of the pandemic had been extreme. So when it comes to funding, we have also included in our messages that there is a need to protect resources for civil society organizations. So I think that this has been our main messages, and I think that with this, I would like to conclude, because this has been a very valuable exchange and space, and I think that we should keep this space or similar spaces like this alive to go through the months that we have ahead, because there is much more for us to do in the coming months and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. It was really a fantastic contribution for our debate and our learning about all these processes. I don't intend to make any summary of what we have had in our session, because I think Maria Jose and Stefano did already the summary, and I think what we have to do is to go forward and to engage ourselves in this debate as Forus as much as we can. Para cerrar entonces la conversación, me gustaría decir que Forus, como en el comienzo yo hablé, está súper activo junto con la sociedad civil organizada del mundo para actuar sobre el evento de 10 al 12 de noviembre sobre Finance in Common, financiamiento en común, que será realizado con la coordinación del gobierno francés, que reunirá cerca de 450 bancas públicas en este debate. Forus está coordinando el grupo que está promoviendo la propuesta oficial de la sociedad civil, coordinando Didra y Sara están muy activas en esto, y como también formulamos una propuesta, como ya les dije, y espero que ya estén recibido los borradores. Entonces, espero que ustedes se inscriban, se presenten a participar del evento como foros para que tengamos alimento para el grupo de trabajo en financiamiento al desarrollo que va obviamente mucho más allá y que intenta y que pretende estar con una agenda de debate mucho más largo y mucho más importante. Bueno, yo creo que fue una sesión riquísima, maravillosa. Agradezco a Stefano, María José, agradezco profundamente a Didra, Arturo, por todo el soporte que me proporcionaron en este proceso, al team de Forus, perfecto, brillante, personas muy comprometidas, que tengo mucho amor y cariño. Y gustaría también de agradecer especialmente a los intérpretes que están en la base voluntaria en este proceso. Maribel Egremi, de Estambul, Turquía, Guillaume Blanc, Cuernavaca, México, Aitana Menjorós, de Madrid, España, y Elizabeth Vaca, México City. Muchas gracias a todos y todas, compañeros y compañeras que participaron de este proceso y que espero que podamos ampliarlo lo máximo posible. Los que tienen preguntas, por favor, envíen a nosotras y nosotros, que encaminaremos a Stefano y María José para que puedan eventualmente responderlas y darnos continuidad a un debate más amplio. Bueno, en este sentido, me gustaría agradecer a todos y dar por encerrada esta sesión. Muchas gracias y que tengan mucho cuidado, se cuiden, salud y que tengan un buenísimo fin de semana. Gracias. Hay, por favor, un survey en andamiento y nos gustaría mucho que ustedes los respondieran, ¿ok? Muchas gracias. Bueno, gracias. Me parece que la concordancia de 100%. Por favor, Arturo, tienes la palabra.
Sí, Yara, muchas gracias. Me parece que ya se respondió la encuesta.
Sí, yo lo vi y parece que está, ¿no? Ya tenemos una respuesta. Bueno, no, yo creo que ya estamos.
Desafortunadamente muchos salieron un poco
Salieron,
antes.
sí, pero no, eso no estaba en mi percepción al final.
No hay
Pero
problema,
bien,
muchas
yo creo
gracias.
que tenemos. Ok, muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias, bonito día.
Gracias, Arturo. Gracias por todo.
A ti, Yara, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to all of you. Have a nice end of the day. Bye-bye.